Today is Saturday, August 22nd, 2026, and it's National Tooth Fairy Day. Now, I've always thought the Tooth Fairy had one of the stranger business models in folklore. Santa brings toys. The Easter Bunny brings candy. The Tooth Fairy sneaks into your bedroom, buys a used body part, and refuses to explain what she plans to do with it. And as it turns out, our modern Tooth Fairy is a fairly recent American creation. Cultures around the world have traditions for handling a child's lost teeth, but they don't all involve a tiny winged dental collector. In some places, children toss the tooth onto the roof. In others, they bury it. And in several traditions, a mouse takes it, which makes a little more sense because mice have strong teeth that keep growing. But America looked at all of that and apparently decided the mouse needed better branding. But today, we're also going to meet an inventor who demonstrated a working steamboat to some of the most famous men in American history, and was still largely forgotten. We'll see how a boat won a trophy and then somehow got the trophy named after itself. And we'll find out how England managed to lose an entire king for more than 500 years before somebody finally thought to check under a parking lot. Welcome to Wait, That's Random, This Day in History. I'm C.L. Burns, voice actor, audiobook narrator, and someone who keeps finding historical stories that sound completely fake until you realize they actually happened. In the summer of 1787, some of the most important political figures in America were gathered in Philadelphia. George Washington was there. Benjamin Franklin was there. James Madison was there. They were meeting behind closed doors at the Constitutional Convention, trying to design a new government without the whole thing falling apart before lunch. And while they were debating the future of the country, a man named John Fitch was working on another idea nearby. He wanted to build a boat powered by steam. Now, steam engines existed, but putting one on a boat and getting that boat to move reliably was a different problem. Fitch had very little formal education and even less money, but he was convinced it could work. His boat was about 45 feet long, and instead of the large paddle wheel we usually picture on an old steamboat, Fitch's design used rows of mechanical oars that dipped into the water and pushed the boat forward. It looked a little like a machine trying to row itself. On August 22, 1787, Fitch demonstrated the boat on the Delaware River in front of several delegates from the Constitutional Convention, and it worked. It wasn't especially fast or graceful, but it moved under steam power. Here were some of the men creating the United States government, watching a boat travel without sails, horses, or anyone rowing by hand. You would think that would be John Fitch's big moment. It wasn't. He spent years trying to find investors and improve the design. He even operated a passenger service between Philadelphia and Burlington, New Jersey. But the boats were expensive to build and maintain. Mechanical problems kept appearing, and the business never became profitable. Then, 22 years after Fitch's demonstration, Robert Fulton launched a commercially successful steamboat on the Hudson River. Fulton became famous. Fitch became a footnote. And that has to be one of the hardest parts of inventing something. You can prove the idea works, build a machine, and demonstrate it in front of George Washington. And history may still remember the person who figured out how to make money from it. But sometimes a name doesn't disappear. Sometimes it ends up attached to something forever, even when that was never the plan. In 1851, a group of wealthy members of the New York Yacht Club sailed across the Atlantic in a new schooner. The boat was called America. They weren't crossing the ocean to sightsee. Britain was holding the Great Exhibition in London, celebrating the industrial power of the British Empire, and the Americans wanted to show up with a yacht capable of beating the best British boats, which is a wonderfully polite 19th century way of starting trouble. The Royal Yacht Squadron organized a race around the Isle of Wight on August 22nd. 15 yachts reached the starting line, 14 British boats, and this one American visitor. The race was for a silver trophy known as the 100 Guinea Cup, and America got off to a terrible start. Its anchor became fouled, so while the other boats began racing, America was still trying to get itself pointed in the right direction. Eventually, it broke free and started catching them. One by one, the American schooner moved past the British yachts. It had a sleek hull and an unusual design that made it faster than many people expected. After a race of more than 50 nautical miles, America crossed the finish line first. According to the story that became part of the race's legend, Queen Victoria asked which boat had finished second. The answer was, "Your Majesty, there is no second." That line may be too perfect to be completely reliable, but the victory was real. The Americans took the trophy home and later donated it to the New York Yacht Club to become the prize for an international sailing competition. And because the winning boat had been named America, the trophy became known as the America's Cup. So despite how it sounds, the America's Cup was not originally named for the United States. It was named for a boat, which happened to be named after the United States. And here's one more odd detail. The famous cup is actually a tall silver ewer that was originally open at both ends. It couldn't even hold a drink. The oldest trophy in international sports is a cup named after a boat, and for most of its life, it wasn't technically much of a cup. And if history can turn something that isn't really a cup into the most famous cup in sailing, it can also turn a dead king into a parking space. On August 22, 1485, Richard III met Henry Tudor at the Battle of Bosworth. Richard actually had the larger army, but several men who were supposedly on his side were hanging back, apparently waiting to see who looked most likely to win before committing themselves, which is a bold interpretation of the word ally. Then Richard spotted Henry Tudor across the battlefield and decided to settle the whole thing himself. He led a direct cavalry charge toward him, came surprisingly close, and was killed in the fighting. That made Richard the last English king to die in battle, and Henry Tudor became Henry VII. Richard's body was stripped, slung over a horse, carried to Leicester, and buried at Greyfriars Church with very little ceremony. No coffin. The grave was too short. This was not exactly the royal farewell package. Then the church was demolished. The exact location disappeared, and eventually people started saying Richard's remains had probably been dug up and thrown into a river. More than 500 years later, researchers worked out where Greyfriars had most likely stood. Unfortunately, there was now a municipal parking lot on top of it. So in 2012, they opened their first trench. On the first day, and almost immediately, they found human leg bones. The skeleton had a severely curved spine and multiple wounds consistent with someone killed in battle. DNA testing connected it to 2 living relatives from Richard's maternal family line, and the combined evidence identified him with a probability of 99.99%. Richard III had been missing for 527 years, except he wasn't in a river. He was under a parking lot. And that idea that somebody can disappear while the things they leave behind keep telling their story brings us to today's birthday. See if you can figure out who this is. He never went to college. After graduating from high school, he sold newspapers during the day and educated himself by spending his nights in libraries. When he was 12, he met a carnival performer called Mr. Electro. The man sat in an electric chair as thousands of volts passed through him, then touched the boy with a sword and told him, "Live forever." The boy took that surprisingly seriously. He began writing constantly, eventually producing hundreds of stories about rocket ships, haunted carnivals, distant planets, small towns, dinosaurs, and ordinary people stumbling into extraordinary situations. One of his best-known books was written in the basement of UCLA's library on a rented typewriter that cost 10 cents per half hour. He worked so quickly because every pause was literally costing him money. The final bill was $9.80, which may be the only time anyone has created a literary classic while racing a parking meter. The book imagined a future where firefighters didn't put out fires. They burned books. If you guessed Fahrenheit 451, you've got him. Born on August 22, 1920, today's birthday belongs to Ray Bradbury, the author of The Martian Chronicles, The Illustrated Man, Something Wicked This Way Comes, and, of course, Fahrenheit 451. I love that today gave us an inventor trying to outrun a rowboat, a trophy that wasn't really a cup, a king found beneath parked cars, and a writer who paid for his masterpiece 1 dime at a time. None of those stories sounds quite real until you discover that it is. History doesn't always hide its best material in castles and museums. Sometimes it leaves it in a library basement, or underneath the space where somebody parked a hatchback. Anyway, that's probably enough kings, carnivals, and questionable parking for one day. And that takes me to something Terry Pratchett once wrote. It's still magic, even if you know how it's done. If you'd like to hear more of my work or see other corners of the internet I've been quietly building things in, you can head over to waitthat'srandom.com. I'm C.L. Burns. Thanks for hanging out with me for a few minutes. I'll see you tomorrow.